Today I have the honor of presenting our keynote speaker, Chantal Kalisa. The focus of her presentation today is going to be on gender and post-conflict Rwanda. Chantal Kalisa is the Director of Women's and Gender Studies and an Associate Professor of Francophone Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She teaches and writes about women and gender topics as they relate to violence, especially as represented in literature and cinema. She is the author of Violence in Francophone, African, and Caribbean Women's Literature. In addition to publishing articles on literary and artistic expressions of the 1994 Rwanda genocide, she is also the co-editor of 10 Years Later, Reflections on the Rwandan Genocide, a volume of critical essays and creative writings on the genocide. Her current project is titled Artistic Expressions in Post-Conflict Rwanda, where she attempts to address the meaning of the explosion of transnational writings on Rwanda as a result of the genocide. Please join me today in welcoming her today as our keynote speaker.
Before I begin, of course, I want to thank the Rwandan Canadian community of Calgary for having been, willing to include me in this commemoration. I live in a place where I don't know, the only Rwandans that I know, they're just students who come to study and then they leave after 4 years. So there is no such a thing. Usually I go to other places, so I'm just so glad that I was able to be included instead of living through this whole month in isolation, I guess. So thank you so much, Amu, for having remembered that I exist, and also for remembering that the topic of gender is very, very important. So as I begin, the way I have been trying to frame this so that I don't make it too academic is to try to think about, at the end of this communication, if you didn't understand anything that I said, think of gender in post-conflict Rwanda as being part of a bigger picture of post-conflict Rwanda trying to practice the politics of inclusion instead of exclusion that has been practiced for, as you're going to see, for actually many centuries. And I'm not going to be talking about the statistics because many of you probably are familiar with those, and I'm just glad Christine was able to do that. What I'm trying to do, I'm trying to almost like provoke my fellow Rwandans, and I'm not excluding the non-Rwandans, but you see what I'm going with this a little bit, trying to go beyond the statistics and see what that really means to talk about gender after the genocide. First of all, what is gender? This was one of the questions that I always ask, having been part of, I guess, gender studies since 1990, since I came to the United States. It occurs to me that when I came here, I didn't understand what gender was. I didn't understand what feminism was. And because of cultural differences, we really don't talk about, we assume we all know what that is. We assume we know that you're talking about men, women. And of course, nowadays, because of science, we know there are other genders. There are variations of those two. But when you talk about gender, men, women living separately, having different roles, having different expectations, both in the culture, both in the contribution to the culture, to society. So here's what my first attempt to sort of look at that. The second topic that you see there, the concept of militarism and masculinity in Rwanda. So basically what I'm starting to talk about here is men, first of all. And militarism, because that has an effect on what happened with the genocide. So what is masculinity? Masculinity is, of course, the ability to, and I'm going to give some other definitions in the next page. This Rangira Beatrice Gadimore is my colleague that we co-edited a book together. She wrote this really interesting article on this particular fact. Some Rwandans here are going to recognize some of these terms. So women's traditional exclusion, I meant to write exclusion from public and military operations. Does anybody know what Ingabo? So my Kinyarwanda is very rusted. I don't put accents where they're supposed to. Ingabo. Ingabo. What is that? Soldiers, right? And there's also a term, and the soldiers are supposed to be men by definition, by default. Of course, sometimes even when you're a woman and you do a very good job, what is the expression they say in Kinyarwanda? Uri umugabo. And English has the same equivalent when somebody tells a woman, you're the man. What does that mean? Ingabo is man. And here's a quote that I got from Gadimore that says, these are men. Actually, it's not every man who is Ingabo. When you talk about masculinity, some men are more men than others. But men who display courage, constancy, patience, firmness, who display physical virility, and without which you're not really considered to be a complete man. That's one area. So women are excluded from military operations. And in order to be included at all, you have to be a man. You have to be named a man. Urumugabo, you're the man. So, and then in Hore, which is another, I should have gotten the picture of that. Most of you have seen the dances, the men who dance with some kind of pie. Those are also men. A woman cannot be in Hore. And they are part of the military operation as well. Ibyivugo, that's oral poetic praises, Kinyarwanda oral poetic praises. Women are not allowed to say them. Especially, they are not allowed to do what they call kwivuga. Only men cannot speak of oneself. See, this sort of exclusion that we have had for centuries. The next is a picture, which is not really a good one, but it's a picture of Dawaga. This is a myth, I guess the legend of Dawaga. There are many versions of this, but this was a woman, some say 17th century or 18th century, it kind of varies, but that's centuries ago. This woman was from a family that didn't have men, and his father was in the army and had to stay far away. The father was getting really old with nobody to replace him. So only a son could go and replace the father when the father is aging out of the army. So what she did, in one version, she cut off her breast and infiltrates and goes and replaces her father as the son. And other versions, of course, she just didn't have that, she didn't have to cut the breast, but she appeared. She kind of appeared. She passed for a man. So then other colleagues started suspecting that she was a woman because she apparently was always seeking privacy when she's doing her hygiene, going to the bathroom. And then finally, the king asked her point blank what she is, and she said she's a woman. And then he did marry her. Most people, if you look at the I'm going to show you some kind of couple of the pictures. That's her too. She has a spear, so she's a woman who's a soldier. And these are some of contemporary appropriations. This is a group of dancers. They call themselves Dabaga as well. And some of you may be familiar with the Dabaga Association, which is an association of former combatants from both ethnic groups, actually, Hutu and Tutsi. So they call themselves. So the way it's interpreted is very positive, but what I'm trying to provoke people is to see how ambiguous actually this is. So what happens when the king marries her, what is he doing? He's domesticating her. He's putting her back into her, where she's, in the place where she belongs. She does not belong in the army. So he kind of reestablishes the harmony between the relationship and men and women. This is what you do, this is what men do, this is what women do. And so he kind of reestablishes that. I'll come back to this legend later because to explain that ambiguity that I feel about her. So that was centuries ago. And during the colonial times, there is also a whole system that affect women in specific ways. As a scholar of literature, of course, actually not just scholar of literature, for those who grew up in a francophone system, you may know the poetry of Léopold Sédar Senghor or Camaralai. One of the songs that we used to sing when we were little was a femme noire, femme africaine, black woman, African woman, praising her. And when you look at it, of course, we always say that this is great, it's very glorifying. But Sédar Senghor and many other people who championed decolonization, they never thought that a woman was affected in a particular way. They just thought the white man leaves, we just go back to our mothers, and everything is great. So there are always questions about how is a woman, how are the women affected by that? One of the ways in which one can explain it is to go from Dabaga, the type of domestication that happens with her, and think about how being civilized, since that was the mission of colonization, affect a woman. In this particular case, it's going to be a Tutsi woman, since we're talking about the genocide against Tutsi. And then I have had people in my women in my life, aunts, my mother, who during colonization were also very privileged, like the Tutsi men, educated. But these are the kind of education women were given was once again to give them another type of domestication, which is what I call what a bourgeois European woman considers to be the role of a woman, which is they taught them how to sew, taught them how to cook, taught them how to do hygiene, and of course, education of children. And also, I forgot, nursing as well was one of them. So the typical kind of nurturing type of expected nurturing that from women. I do remember, like for instance, cooking, but these are done not in a Rwandan way, but in a way of introducing the ways of European women. So in French we say embourgeoisé. This is how you become civilized. I remember my grandmother telling me that the first time she ate, she said she always felt like so proud that she ate grass before anybody else ate grass. Can you guess what grass is? Salad. Because salad was not, nobody ate grass before, but she felt like really proud that, yeah, I ate grass. Her husband was what we call mutuare, so was very much, interacting with the colonizers. So everything is sort of, becoming sort of, but it's still what my point about domesticating women. And now we go to this notion of the beauty of the Tutsi woman. Or before I forget, did I say that I'm a feminist? You wouldn't guess. Feminism, I know, is a word. This is why I wanted to provoke my fellow Rwandans. That provoke, I don't know, some kind of irrational thinking about what a woman who's a feminist is. But when I'm trying to be nice, I just say, well, maybe I'm not a feminist. I just do feminist act. I act, but the definition, as we heard also your Minister of Justice this morning, feminism is really about advancing rights. And it's not about advancing rights of women. It's about advancing rights of everybody. Men's rights, especially children's rights. Rights for the elderly, rights for people. So it's really seeking like a very, very simple notion of justice. So that's my conception of feminism. African feminism tends to be much more negotiable than 70s, American feminism. But this is why, when you call yourself a feminist, that's what it is. Now, going back to my talk, the myth, the beauty of the Tutsi woman, as they are also enjoying the privileges of being Tutsi under colonialism, they also enjoyed the ability to set so-called standards of beauty, setting standards of beauty. You also have, probably some of you have followed what the so-called Hamitic myth, in which Tutsis are not really Africans. They just happen to have migrated there. They are the sons of Shem. In the Bible, Shem was, one of his sons saw him naked and then cursed him. But deep down, the Tutsi men and women, they're really Europeans who just happen to have a little bit darker skin. So they sort of formulated these standards of beauty. And in the discourse of genocide, that's exactly what continues to happen. I have isolated the 4 of the famous 10 Hutu commandments that were published in Kangura in 1990, 4 years before the final, solution. But that was the beginning of the war as well. So if you look at these, if you can quickly read them, if you look at these, they're repeating the whole myth of beauty of the Tutsi woman. So when they pit the Hutu woman against the Tutsi woman, what they are trying to do is to try to say, to try to deny that beauty, even though they are kind of embracing it at the same time. So there's some kind of contradiction in these commandments. Looking at the first one, you can't marry, or you are a traitor if you marry a Tutsi wife, or concubine, or secretary, or protege. But if you look at the history of powerful men in Rwanda, many of them tended to marry Tutsi women as a way to go upwardly in this world of this kind of fantastic, I would say, mystic almost world of, having access to that beautiful woman. I am powerful, I minister this, I can get not just a Hutu woman, but I can really get a Tutsi woman who supposedly under colonization wasn't accessible to him. For those who know the history of slavery, of course you know that there's always that kind of a dynamic, this sort of like triangular relationship between the master, and his wife who's white, and also the slave woman. So you have this sort of like triangular relationship there. I should say, because I do literature, so one of the things that are interesting in terms of reading fiction and nonfiction is the ability to look at some of the things that people remember about this reputation of beauty or of that. So as soon as Tutsis were kicked out of Rwanda, for instance, you're going to find a lot of Tutsi women now being considered to be like prostitutes. They are being forced to become lovers of powerful men who are Hutu now under that first regime. And they acquired this reputation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a few seconds. The second one, obviously, kind of is very repetitive. They're trying to show the Hutu woman as good as. But if you're a psychologist, you can see what's underlying that. They're still creating this sort of hierarchy between the two ethnic groups. The Tutsi woman, you can read it in that second one, is still considered to be the more superior, and the much more. They're reassuring the Hutu woman that she can be as good, basically. And then it goes on and on and on. And so we're talking about 10 commandments, and we have 4 commandments on the woman. So gender is very, very much a part of the discourse of genocide. 4, that's almost 50%. Here's one of the most famous, there were cartoons that were published. Some of them are worse than this. I didn't want to put them there. But this is the most famous one that's a little bit more mild. And General Dallaire is part of that caption. So you see a military, and you see General Dallaire with 2, again, beautiful Tutsi women. But in this picture, he adds more content to who the Tutsi woman is, because what is she? She's very sexualized. She's depicted in such a way that adds to the dehumanization, to the demeaning, showing the woman as evil, all kinds of negative adjectives there. So the specific ways in which, as a woman, women had unique experiences have to do with those kind of reputation, the beauty and also the sexualized part. Now, before I continue talking about, again, trying to sort of do a little bit of a switch from what you mentioned about in terms of how the kind of, violence that was committed on women, some of the things I have researched in the past have to do with, we don't really think about war unless it's happening, right? You've heard the term peacetime. What does that mean? Peacetime. What happens during the peacetime? Is peace the opposite of war? We don't think about that. So what happens in peacetime, for instance, you're going to find, militarization continues. Weapons are done. People train for the future war. And then also, at least with what I have observed and in the most recent scholarship, with the US war in the Middle East, what happens when soldiers come home, you're gonna see a rise of what? Domestic violence. You see a rise of all kinds of abuses. So peacetime is not really peaceful. As a matter of fact, there have been women who have testified they would have preferred that men stayed away because it's much more anxious, they are anxious ridden because they never know what the men are going to do. And actually, it's not just men, there are women as well who do commit violence against their family members. So peacetime is not always peaceful, and that's where people prepare for the next war. They up the ante sometimes, they make better weapons, much more powerful weapons. And then the other keywords are war and women. Again, and of course, and other people who are vulnerable, the disabled, the people who are older. Those are very much affected by war, especially when you are in the war zone. And because, again, that exclusion from being part of the army, women don't have a say about how war is conducted. And women, they're going to suffer because they're going to be used in order to demoralize the men. So again, here, these are some of the examples in which gender is very much part of that. The old term, I mean, the term is still actually correct, is rape as a weapon of war. That's what used to be done, used before the trial in Arusha that also added another term to it, which I'm gonna come back to. It's part of the discourse of war. And in addition, another example, during peacetime, rape still occurs. So gender is very much part of that. There are so many consequences, issues that happens after basically a genocide. A genocide, in my, I guess, summarized definition, you mentioned that the Lemkin's definition, but when you think about it, genocide is an obliteration of institutions. Nothing is off limit. You could think of institutions as being justice system, education system. You can think of economics. You can think of those kind of institutions. But you can also think about cultural institutions. A few years ago, I did write something about the ways in which language can no longer be sufficient after genocide. One of the examples that I gave is if you think about a village in Rwanda where people, neighbors are just crossing paths in the morning, they greet each other, what do they say? Girabana, have children. Girumugabo, have a husband. Mwaramutse, which literally means in Kinyarwanda, did you wake up alive? Okay? So think about after the genocide. You see your neighbor, the kids, the husband, the wife have been killed. Are you going to use that language? It's impossible. So the language changes. The language changes, and especially for those who have been traumatized, to say mwaramutse is such a weird question. Because then you're going to say mwaramutse mute, so the languages are, and then the famous, of course, quote is like, God sleeps in Rwanda. Can no longer be true either, right? You've heard of the term, God sleeps in Rwanda. God goes to work elsewhere, but he comes back and sleeps in Rwanda. A Rwandan is going to ask, how could that sentence, that expression be true anymore? God didn't come to sleep in Rwanda that night when my family was killed, or when I was, and some of the survivors have used these words to say they died that day, even though they are still physically alive. So language changes. So even language can traumatize a person very easily just by saying those words. You mentioned other consequences like AIDS, but there are also some other illnesses that some visible, some invisible, that are due to mutilation and other unspeakable extreme violence. Also, children who were born as a result of sexual violence. I mentioned that they're unwanted. There have been some documentaries that have really truly documented how these children's future is very much in question, mostly because they are rejected by family. They are the result of an act of violence. They traumatize the person because they remind them of what happened every single day. Can you imagine having a child you don't want that way? It's really hard. Widowhood, you mentioned widowhood. Again, this is still about women mostly, and poverty, lack of formal education at the beginning. There are just so many obstacles. And I should also mention that because of inclusion in Rwanda right now, people do, Avega does include men now. So in Rwanda, gender doesn't mean women, it means both. So they do include those. And lots of families and lots of all kinds of issues. Justice system. I'm not an expert on justice, but I am familiar with how those had to be changed. I call it injustice simply because I didn't want to, again, I work in ambiguity. You can say justice system is when there's a trial and there's a conclusion. Justice has been rendered depending on who, whether it's the perpetrator or the victim, so we don't know. Then you can think about how is it possible you can render justice in this context? There is one of the positive things that happened, of course, is that women now can own land. They can inherit property. And this, I don't know if the people who were there right after the conflict were really thinking about gender at the time necessarily. I think they were being very pragmatic. So if a woman cannot inherit her husband's property and there's nobody left to inherit it, what's going to happen to the property? So there was some kind of pragmatic measures as well, in addition to that. International justice, of course, we know about now the other expression, rape as a weapon of genocide. The part of the injustice, I mentioned there, the book by Esther Mujawaya, Survivante, who tells of a story of a woman who goes to Arusha to testify about how she was raped. And this is how there are specific ways in which women can be denied. I mean, denialism can occur as well. In the book, the lawyer, the defense lawyer, asks the woman a very undignifying question, which is, so you say you were raped. How many days have you gone without a shower during that time? And then what do you think this man would have those intimate relations with you when you stink, when you smell? You see? But that said, of course, the story of rape is always a difficult one because in a lot of cultures, and specifically in Kinyarwanda culture, this is a taboo subject. I mean, people would rather not testify. Here in North America, I know of many cases in which women do not report what happened to them because they're afraid to go, and then their experience is denied by the courts, in front of the courts, publicly, which is another way to re-traumatize people. Finally, I think this is my final, very quickly, because I know time is running out. You mentioned, of course, women being in the, 64% in the parliament now. And I know at the beginning, people were just saying, okay, so you can just recruit some women and they just go and sit there and appear. And I'm sure there's some of you who have had those experiences when you go in a meeting. At least in my university, every committee has to have somebody, some diversity, right? And there have been cases where I've been recruited because I'm a woman of color, I'm a woman, you know, and then I go there and it's like, I'm just there, to be present. And my name appears and it's legal, you know. There is no injustice. You know, where there have been men who do not expect me to contribute, frankly. And this is academia, right? Where we all have PhDs. So it's not like, you know, I didn't earn it. But what happens, so my question, what I'm trying to figure out in Rwanda is that, what does that mean to have women in the parliament? What do they contribute? What are their skills? What are their talent? What is it that they're contributing? What changes when they appear? And that's why I'm using the term, what happens when women appear on the table and they start really contributing? What kind of questions are being asked? I can give you a couple of examples. For instance, some of the bills that I've seen debated in the parliament, actually in the two houses, you know, we have things like introducing bills about child abuse, domestic violence, you know, things that probably a lot of men, even though they know it's a problem, they will never think about. Now, let's talk about education, some very specific women-related. Now education is sort of free for everybody through K-12, but people have noticed that when girls hit puberty, absenteeism increases. Can you imagine why? 5 days a month, they don't go to school because they have their period and they have no way to protect themselves. So they have to stay home. So a man probably would never think about that, really. But a woman in the parliament is going to think about, wait a minute, let's solve that problem. It's the first problem that should be solved so that we can allow these kids to go to school. That's an example. Some other examples, I mean, there's so many other examples. So this is why people say there's so much going on in Rwanda in terms of gender. But I want to sort of challenge about exactly what that means. Not just say numbers. There were, a long time ago, there were some Rwandan friends, men, who would use the term, oh, those Kagame women. You know? But then again, when I go and lecture in Rwanda, all of a sudden, all these men are taking these classes on gender. They do realize over time that it's very important to understand that mindset because it's by law, it permeates everywhere, in every ministry, every aspect of public life. It's very important. So you have to understand that. They may not necessarily, you know, find women to be, you know, as good, but they're definitely there. I think it's going to take time, but I think we're going to understand exactly what is that the women can contribute. And in other aspects, economics, the Beata that your organization sponsored there, the ways in which she is being very entrepreneurial. You know, she's trying to find ways to survive, but also mostly make progress. So creativity is key to women. Finally, this is my conclusion. I'm going back to Dabaga, whom I said that I'm criticizing because I don't find her to be particularly, you know, she's domesticated. It changes nothing for centuries for Rwandan women. Not that it should, but it doesn't really change it much. But then again, The rest of the story is that the king realized that she took all kinds of extreme measures to be able to solve a particular problem that was a problem for many fathers and for many men who were soldiers. And he allowed men to go home more often than they used to. So he changed the law. Why? Dabaga did act, I would say feminist act, allowed policy change in the kingdom. So finally, the last one, men and contemporary Rwandan women. To elaborate a little bit, there's some, if you go to Rwanda, you're going to be surprised by something that we don't see very much in North America. How many women mechanics do you go to when your car has trouble? How many women mechanics do you see in the shop? Go to Rwanda, you're going to see. So invading male space, what does that mean for men? And you know, there are just a lot of creative ways in which women are not burdened by the exclusion. And being able to think that I can become a mechanic is not something that I grew up thinking at all. But I don't see why not. Why not? So I think I'm going to stop there, and so that my colleague can come and complete this. But I think, you know, post-conflict gender is something that we have to scrutinize a little bit more than just the numbers. That's my point, and think about inclusion versus exclusion. Thank you.